Hello and welcome to Woman Inherits the Earth, a mother-daughter podcast about the representation of women in movies and television. I am Tess Adair, a writer and the author of the paranormal mystery series The Karanzan Chronicles and Beth's Daughter.
And I am Beth Von Baron, Tessa's mother and also a writer. In this podcast, we talk about movies and television that feature women as the leading characters or where the story focuses on women or women's issues. Our discussions will also touch on roles available to women, how men have dominated the film industry since its beginnings, and whether or not that is changing. Today, we are discussing Black Panther. This is a movie that was made in 2018. Has a runtime of 2 hours and 14 minutes. It was directed by Ryan Coogler and written by Ryan Coogler and Joe Robert Cole. Stars Chadwick Boseman, Michael B. Jordan, Lupita Nyong'o, Danai Gurira, I want to say Danny, but it's probably Danai, and Martin Freeman. But it also features Sterling K. Brown, yay, St. Louis guy, Forrest Whitaker, and Angela Bassett, the goddess.
Also Letitia Wright and Winston Duke. The IMDb summary is T'Challa, heir to the hidden but advanced kingdom of Wakanda, must step forward to lead his people into a new future and must confront a challenger from his country's past. And to get a little bit more in depth, if you haven't seen the movie, which you should watch the movie before you listen to this, but Chadwick Boseman plays T'Challa, aka the Black Panther, and basically a previously unknown man shows up, Michael B. Jordan, playing, as he is called in the IMDb page, Eric Killmonger. I'm pretty sure they actually give him a full different name at one point, Eric something else.
I know, but I refer to him as Killmonger in all of my notes. So
yeah, it's a comic book movie. Killmonger is his comic book villain name, and he turns out to be T'Challa's cousin, basically. His father was T'Challa's father's brother. T'Challa's father was T'Chaka, the previous king and the previous Black Panther, and he found out that his brother N'Jobu had betrayed Wakanda and given a criminal known as Claw a bunch of their vibranium. Because of this, that this was considered a betrayal, so T'Chaka killed N'Jobu and made the somewhat unfathomable choice to leave N'Jobu's son behind, and that is Eric Killmonger.
And that whole scene is weird to watch, but we'll get to why it is.
Yeah, so basically the movie becomes kind of a struggle between T'Challa and Killmonger over who will be the king. Killmonger shows up to challenge T'Challa using Wakanda's kind of ancient rites to challenge the leadership. It's supposed to be a fight to the death. They actually go through the trouble of showing you an earlier challenge. M'Baku from the Mountain Tribe comes down to challenge T'Challa when he is first crowned king, and he loses, thus kind of showing us how this normally goes. So T'Challa beats M'Baku and chooses not to kill him and instead forces him to yield. This is an important part of the ceremony because basically one person either has to yield or die, or else the challenge is not complete. And this is basically important because Killmonger wins the fight, but he ends up throwing T'Challa off of a waterfall, and T'Challa doesn't die. So technically, the challenge never completed.
And also, the guy from the Hill Country who comes down to do the challenge in the first one in the early part of the movie, he was a good choice for this in terms of storytelling because of his importance towards the end of the movie when he basically comes in and helps them Wakanda survive.
Yeah.
There are 5 tribes in Wakanda, and his is the mountain tribe. They live up, where there's snow year round.
Yeah.
And they seem to be the most, it's hard to tell how advanced these cultures are, because they go from having this, they show us all this amazing technology in one scene, and then you see the town people, and they're like farmers, and it's just a very...
I think you're just supposed to believe that they've, preserved their traditions.
Yeah,
so
it's a very traditional society. society. Yes.
Yeah. And they do still have, like, it sort of feels like Wakabi, Daniel Kaluuya's character, is like a shepherd or something. He's like tending a field of sheep at one point when he's talking to T'Challa. But I think that's just supposed to be that they've preserved their culture. My understanding is that the mountain people, the mountain tribe in the comics, are like straight up evil. They're like an actual antagonist in the comics. So they kind of got softened for this movie.
Yeah, and I think this is the biggest conflict for them in Wakanda. This tribe, this mountain tribe, is the biggest source of conflict. But they're not evil. They're not presented in the movie as evil at all.
Yeah.
They're kind of struggling, and they don't think that the king pays enough attention to them.
Yeah.
So that's he basically comes down and does the challenge, or challenges T'Challa, so he can get their attention. You need to pay attention to us too.
Yeah. After we think T'Challa has died, the queen, Ramonda, and Nakia, T'Challa's love interest, end up going to M'Baku and his people and asking for help. It turns out that M'Baku basically has found T'Challa's body, and that's how we find out that he's not dead. He found him and preserved him in some ice that very conveniently looks exactly like the sand that they use to do the Black Panther ritual. He's conveniently saved him in a little bit of ice or I guess it's snow, very powdery snow that looks very sand-like.
No, it's definitely a throwback scene because you see him coming out of the snow just as he went into and came out of the red sand.
This is also when he goes into the snow, they use some of the flour that they use to transfer the Black Panther power, and it sends the people who take it into a kind of trance. It's sort of unclear exactly if it's just like a hallucination, but it's also sort of like they go to another plane where they meet their ancestors. And so when this happens in the snow, he meets his dad and finally gets to confront him about the existence of Killmonger and why his dad didn't take him.
And it's the second time he sees his dad in this plane of existence. But there's two parts to this ritual when you become king. They drink something that takes their powers away so that they are normal in terms of strength and abilities when it comes to the challenger. So they're playing on an even a level playing field. And then when you win the challenge, you drink this purple stuff that gives you your power back.
Yeah.
Well, when Killmonger beats T'Challa has taken the stuff that takes away his power. So he's on the same level with T'Challa. I mean, with Killmonger. These names, I am not going to get any of these names right.
There's a lot of characters.
Say that up front. A lot of characters and a lot of names. Killmonger, well, everybody thinks that T'Challa's dead. So he takes over the kingdom, he becomes the king, and he destroys the garden of these purple flowers that gives the king, only the king, this super strength.
But it also is what allows them, I think, to go to that ancestral plane. I think it does both.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. It does both. It gives them their strength, and they also go to this ancestral plane, and he meets his father both times. First time, it's a loving experience. They're just talking.
For T'Challa,
for T'Challa. Yeah. And then the second time, when he's getting his strength back so he can come back and reclaim his kingdom, it's a very different experience, and we'll get to that in a minute. So there are 5 tribes in Wakanda. This is a story of their homeland. It's got lots of things in it. It's got romance. It's got hand-to-hand combat. There's a chase scene. There's a shoot-'em-up scene in a bar. So in some ways, it's a Western because there's all these scenes. It's very typical. There are a lot of very typical kinds of scenes in this movie that make it up. And of course, there's racism because it's basically a Black-centric film. It's a film about Black people. Andy Serkis's character, and we know who Andy Serkis is, right?
Gollum, yeah.
Did I say his name right? Yeah.
Yeah.
He plays Gollum.
Yeah. He plays a lot of motion capture type roles. Like most famously Gollum, but I probably couldn't even like list all of the other characters like that he's played. But like if you've ever seen an important monstrous looking character in a movie, they were either played by Andy Serkis or Doug Jones.
And so when you see Andy Serkis in real life, you might not recognize him.
Yeah.
But as soon as you read his name, you know, that's who that is.
The newer Planet of the Apes, Andy Serkis did like the main ape character, Caesar.
Oh, okay.
I did want to talk a little bit about Marvel. This movie is a Marvel movie. We're going to do a run of comic book movies here, not exclusively Marvel, but we will do a couple of Marvel ones. We're not going to do the whole Marvel canon because there's way too much to discuss. They divided it into like 3 stages or whatever, and I think this was technically like stage 2, because like the stage 1 was like Iron Man and Captain America. This was after there had been some crossover movies, but prior to Endgame. Unlike a lot of the Marvel movies now, this one does largely exist as a self-contained story. The character of Black Panther was introduced in Captain America Civil War, but it was a kind of a bit role. It only sets us up for this movie in that is when T'Challa's father died.
Yeah, and that's a very important setup because it sets up the whole movie.
I mean, it's an important setup in that it like starts off the story, but most of the story, like you could watch Black Panther without ever having watched any of the other.
You could. You absolutely
Marvel
could.
movies, which I think is important because I feel like this was one of the last good Marvel movies. A lot of the Marvel movies these days, you can't watch them without having an extensive knowledge of the whole
and not only
canon.
that, but it's really hard to keep on top of what happens in which movie.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many of them. I just gave up. I mean, that's the reason when we were prepping for this podcast, I had to look up which movie Black Panther shows up in because I can't remember. They just kind of all blur together. I mean, I basically know the storyline, but if you were to ask me, if you were to describe a scene or an important plot line in one of these movies, I could not tell you which movie it was in.
So I think that this movie, what this movie has going for it is that it is largely a self-contained story. But I will say, like, it was kind of wild for me to sit down and watch this. When I first watched the movie, I watched it in a theater, I think on opening weekend. My partner and I went to a big IMAX screening, and it was like packed, and it was a super fun experience. Very fun movie to watch in a theater because it's very like cinematic. The colors are super saturated, and the action scenes. Mm-hmm. I will say, I think this has some of the best action scenes in Marvel movies because it doesn't do that. It doesn't do that thing where it's like constantly cutting and you can't tell what's going on. It does a very deliberate job of like following on one character for a long time. And I noticed this time around in the fight scenes, it does a very good job of color coding all of the characters. Like Okoye is always wearing red. Even when they have her in her little disguise, she's wearing a bright red dress that is the exact same color as her red armor. So you can always tell visually where she is. And they also use that dress to great effect. When she's wearing the dress, they have her do like a number of different like slow-mo flips where you can just see the skirt like trailing behind her. It's some very good action scenes, which I think is because this is also one of the last Marvel movies where they hired a director with a vision who like knew what he wanted to do with this story. And I think a lot of the later Marvel movies, they just kind of hire directors who are willing to do what the producers want. And I don't think that's a great creative decision. But anyway, what I feel like is a little bit difficult watching this movie this time around, it's 2.5 hours long and it moves at a breakneck pace. You have to remember like so much while you're watching the movie. And I think it's very clear. It's very well done. It's just like this movie has a million characters and a million things that happen. There is like no moment of pause and reflection except when T'Challa is talking to his dad on the ancestral plane. Those are like the only moments of like stillness and quiet, and there's 2 of them. Everything else is just like going.
I think that the final scene too with the kids, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Once everything is basically wrapped up.
And how many wrap-ups? There are like 3 wrap-ups in this. You get that scene,
yeah,
and then you get another scene, then we get the credits, and then we get another scene, and that's Marvel is bad about that.
Yeah.
They want you to come to see the next movie in the canon. So you get this final scene, and then there's a few credits, and you get another final scene. And then they do all of the credits, even the music, everything is done, and you get another final scene because that's what Marvel does.
That very last final scene has nothing to do with the movie.
No, the characters are in the movie, but nothing. Yeah,
it's completely unnecessary. Yeah, it's got Shuri. It basically reminds you that Bucky Barnes is like still around. I know he's got like another name, but Bucky Barnes, played by Sebastian Stan, just shows up to be like, I'm still here, and Shuri exchanges some words with him, and then it's over, and it's like, Black Panther will return in the next Avengers movie. And it's just like, A, this has nothing to do with this movie, and B, this is unnecessary for the next movie. You just threw this in here because Marvel wants you to stay through the whole credits and then come back for the next one. It's just an advertisement.
And they know that everybody knows that they do
Yes.
this. It used to be that you and I were the only people in the theater watching the credits. And now everybody's, if it's a Marvel movie, everybody stays for the credits now.
Or what happens is you'll look around and everyone is on their phones looking up whether there's an end credit scene at the end of this movie.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I feel like they did do something clever in that some of those end credit scenes are like really funny. Like I remember there's like an Avengers end credit scene where they're all just like eating hamburgers or falafel or something.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, that one's funny. So we stick around thinking that we might get something out of the end credit scene, but this one was just so pointless. So that's just kind of a summary of Marvel. This exists within the Marvel universe. I don't think we need to talk that much more about Marvel in this one. We're probably going to do Captain Marvel next, so we might talk a little bit more about Marvel in that one because that one's a little bit more interconnected. Yeah. But this one is functionally kind of its own fantasy world because Wakanda is a fictional country and their whole history is fictional, and it's got some of the most intense world building in all of Marvel because it's not just, this is American history but slightly altered. It's this whole country that never existed and they've got, a monarchy and all of these traditions.
It was a very smart move on Marvel's part because their audience is black and white. But here is a movie that was basically a gift to their black audience because they're not represented in most of these movies. They see there's an occasional black person. Well, Don Cheadle is a recurring character, but he's a minor recurring character in a lot of these movies. And every time I see him, I think more Don Cheadle, please. And we never get more because he's getting older, and they want younger people in these movies. So Black Panther was a great way to keep that segment of their audience. I thought it was very smart, but it's also very respectful of the story that it's telling about this particular culture in Africa that looks like when they show the map at the beginning of the movie, they show a map and then a little bit of a history of Wakanda. It looks like it's right in the middle of Sudan. Of course, that's not the case. They never mention Sudan, but that's the geographic area that they point to on the map.
Black Panther is also kind of a radical character to do. I'm pretty sure he is named for the Black Panthers, who were civil rights activists who have something of a controversial history, and also the existence of the Dora Milaje. I wanted to talk a little bit about The Woman King, the movie that we already watched here, but the Dora Milaje are largely inspired by the actual female warriors who are in The Woman King. And I feel like the sort of interesting kind of Ouroboros of that is I very much feel like The Woman King was only allowed to get its funding because Black Panther was so incredibly successful. That they touch on some very similar themes. I will say I think that The Woman King does a better job with the themes because The Woman King is kind of able to come at them in a much more direct way and say some very clear things about it. And also it's, more closely tied to real history, even though it is a fictional story. But that's just kind of an interesting Ouroboros. The Dora Milaje are like inspired by the warriors of Dahomey, and then The Woman King gets to be a movie because Black Panther came out and was so wildly successful. I think when Black Panther came out, it was like the biggest release that Marvel had ever had.
And I don't know if it was nominated for any Academy Awards. We can look that up really quick. But I will say that Black Panther appeared in the comic books, created by Jack Kirby, of course, not Stan Lee, but we'll give him his marketing credit. I mean, he was a marketer, not a creator.
He wrote some dialogue.
He wrote some stuff, yeah. But Jack Kirby was the genius, and that was 1966, which is the exact year that the Black Panther Party was founded. So I don't know if how that's a pretty close coincidence in terms of the year. So maybe it was and maybe it wasn't, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, either way, like what is your main association with the term Black Panther?
Yeah, I agree.
The Black
Panthers. I agree.
To that effect, this movie is very much in conversation with America's history with white supremacy. It's interesting to me that it never explicitly mentions the slave trade, but it's like all about the slave trade. Killmonger's line at the end, I think, is the first explicit reference.
Great line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I took very few notes. I mainly took notes on things that Killmonger said that I think are very important to understanding what he represents in the plot. And I mean, I could just go into that now unless you have something else that you want to talk about before we do that.
Just a few things. One of the things I was really impressed with in the film was what a good job the actors did with the dialect accents, with the accents. Sterling K. Brown, he only has maybe 3 minutes on screen at the beginning, and then there's a ancestral plane flashback episode with him at the end, towards the end of the movie. So he only has about 3 or 4 minutes on screen, and he's always fantastic. I mean, he's my male Angela Bassett. I really love Sterling K. Brown. I think he's a brilliant actor, and he gets the accent down, and he is the first one you see that for sure is not an African person. He grew up in St. Louis and was able to, get this accent down so perfectly. And then everybody else does too. And we should talk maybe just a little bit about Mr. Boseman, who it's a very sad story and everybody knows it. He was sick and dying with cancer when he was making this film, and you cannot even see that, except for there's just one telltale sign. He's very thin in this film, and if you look at his movie where he played Jackie Robinson, he's made several wonderful movies. This was one of them. I think it was just called 42, and he's a much chunkier guy in that movie, and it was a few years earlier. So he's lost, and he didn't lose that weight for the movie. He lost it because he was sick. We had an art exhibit here in St. Louis at the St. Louis Art Museum about a year ago, and it had had costumes. It was a costume exhibit, and one of the final things on exhibit was one of the outfits that he wore in the movie as Black Panther on exhibit in the art museum. And I looked at that and I thought, a child could barely get into this. That's how thin he was at that point.
But was it the Black Panther suit?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the suits that he wore
that was
in the movie.
Yeah, that was also on display at one point in Mopop, and my partner and I went to see it, and we took a picture of my partner standing next to it, and I was just like, he's so small. Like
he was so small, and he wasn't a tall man either. If you look at in some of the scenes where the other guys are always towering over him. He was not a very tall man, so to lose that much weight, he really looked.
I mean, he still looked very muscular though.
He's very muscular, and he's very strong. That he looks healthy in the movie, which is when he died just a few months after the movie was released.
Oh no, it was 2 years after the movie.
Was it 2 years after? Okay, so but he had been sick during the filming of this movie.
Yeah.
So, and I think he made another movie after this.
He made a couple. At least one thing that he was in, it looks like, came out after his death. But yeah, I've got his IMDb page up. I mean, he's in a bunch of the Marvel movies, but post Black Panther, he was also in 21 Bridges, Da 5 Bloods, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and a TV show called What If?
It was a small role in Ma Rainey, I think. Maybe not. Maybe it was a bigger. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that one.
I think the What If thing is also a Marvel property. But yeah, kind of the extra tragic thing about his death is that his career was like really going places. He was in so much stuff.
He was compared to Denzel Washington. I mean, he was considered the next great black actor, which is in itself is kind of a shame. Can't he just be the next great actor?
Yeah, and I had no idea he was sick. I have a memory of his death the way I have a memory of like 9/11, because it was like during the pandemic, and it was one of the first times that my friends and I had like gotten together to hang out outside. We were having like a picnic at a park, trying to like social distance hang out, and I looked down at my phone to check a text message and got like a Google alert that Chadwick Boseman had died. I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like a really ill-timed prank. But then I clicked on it and I was like, oh my God, it was just devastating. And in the middle of a terrible year, it was this moment of like we were trying to get things together, and then all of a sudden Black Panther died. It was just so devastating.
It was devastating. And there's a history of actors and actresses who have packed a lot of career into a very short amount of time, died really young.
James Dean?
James Dean is probably the biggest example. 3 movies and he was gone. And there are a few others too. But Chadwick Boseman, I don't know how old he was.
I want to say he was around 40. Yeah, he was like 44.
He was 44. And how many movies did he make in that short amount of time? Well, he was born the year I graduated from high school.
I think he was at least nominated for an Oscar for one of his roles, but I don't remember which one.
So his career went from 2008 to 2022, and he made 16 movies during that time, several of which were in the Marvel canon: Captain America, Black Panther. He was also in Avengers: Infinity War, Avengers Endgame as well. And then, of course, he had a role, archive footage, was used in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had died by then. But anyway, so he was a pretty remarkable actor. My favorite role of his, other than this one, is as Jackie Robinson in 42. It was a really, really good. I've never seen Marshall. I'd like to see that. He played Thurgood Marshall. He's got a couple of movies that I haven't seen yet that I would like. He played James Brown. I haven't seen that one yet. I love James Brown. Okay, so I have some Chadwick viewing to do.
I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to talk about this without becoming unlistenable. So
okay,
we might need to discuss. We might need to move along.
Let's stop that right there because it's an emotional topic.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other actor that I was really impressed with was the young actor who played the young James, who was in the scene with Sterling K. Brown when he finds out that he himself, N'Jobu, has been a plant, and he was sent back to do some investigating for Wakanda. That they try to keep an eye on everything that's going on out in the rest of the world. But what he decided to do was sell vibranium to somebody who turned out to be a bad guy. And I'm unclear as to whether or not he knew this guy was a bad guy. But the guy who's working with him, the character's name is Zuri, and he turns out to be a double agent. So he's working with N'Jobu, but he's really working for the king to keep an eye on N'Jobu.
Yeah, N'Jobu doesn't know that Zuri is from Wakanda. He thinks that he's just a guy that he met in Oakland, but it turns out that he's a plant also who was basically there to keep an eye on N'Jobu.
Yeah. And Zuri, or James, or whatever his name is, he goes by both, he is stunned and disbelieving when the king walks in, and then when it's revealed that he is actually a spy there to spy on N'Jobu, he completely changed. Anyway, the actor's just really good.
Yeah.
It's 2 completely different characters he's playing in the same scene.
Mm-hmm.
So he's pretty good. Nakia is another favorite character. Is she the ex-girlfriend, or is Shuri?
Yeah, Shuri's the sister. Nakia is the ex-girlfriend. Okoye is the head of the Dora Milaje.
Shuri teases her that, be careful, he's going to freeze up when he sees you, and he does.
Yeah.
Because he still loves her, and she has, this is a bigger topic that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but she wants to be her own, she wants to be a warrior, she wants to have a life and a career, she doesn't want to be married to the king. That she would be living in his shadow.
And I think also she's very dedicated to her work because she sees it as important for the African diaspora. She's gone out into the world in a way that T'Challa hasn't. She's very similar to N'Jobu. She is a spy, basically, who has been sent out into the world. She just doesn't have the same violent desire to, she wants to help people, but she doesn't want to, she's basically kind of the good version of that argument, and she has been moved by her work to want to continue doing her work. And I think that's important because I think it is about her wanting to have her own life, but I think it's also about, she kind of represents an argument in the story. And her argument is this non-violent intervention. She thinks she tacitly disapproves of Wakanda hiding itself from the world. And as far as she knows, at the beginning of the story, T'Challa's going to continue that policy. And
he was, I think.
Yeah.
And that changes over the course of this. They're an isolationist country. They look out for themselves. They don't necessarily help the outside world, and that changes. The philosophy changes during the course of the movie.
Mm-hmm. I will just say real fast, Nakia is played by Lupita Nyong'o, who is just breathtakingly beautiful.
She is.
I don't want to
amazing.
Linger too long on how beautiful female actresses are, but
I know
every time I see her, it takes my breath away a little bit. She's so beautiful.
She's also a model. She's
Yeah.
so beautiful that she is also a model. And if you open up a copy of Vogue or Vanity Fair, if you open up Vanity Fair, she's in there. She is respected for her beauty. She's got a peaceful beauty. And she's all over the place.
Yeah, she's been in a bunch of stuff. I believe she's also in Us. But yeah, she's also a person with just like an absolutely skyrocketing career. But yeah, let's go ahead and start talking about the themes. That's the main thing I want to talk about. Basically, I view this script as putting forth 3 points of view: T'Challa's point of view, Killmonger's point of view, and Nakia's point of view. And Nakia is the one that's right. And I say that because that is my interpretation of the script. I think the script has decided that Nakia is basically the voice of reason, but she's also the middle ground between the initial T'Challa perspective and the Killmonger perspective. Because T'Challa, at the beginning, this is basically his journey. He has to learn what kind of a leader he's actually going to be. So who he is at the beginning of the script is different from at the end. And at the beginning, he's just kind of defaulting to what his father did and what his ancestors did. He is the latest in a monarchical line, and the stance of the monarchy has the whole time been, we're going to remain hidden from the world. We're not going to interfere. If we let the world know who we are, then they will plunder us the way they have plundered other African nations before. So we're going to keep our wealth to ourselves and not help anyone. And they're doing that to protect themselves, but kind of the whole point of the movie is that that's wrong. They're doing it to protect themselves, but it is at the cost of everyone around them, basically, because they are the most technologically advanced country in Africa. Again, this movie does manage to avoid explicitly mentioning the slave trade, but while the slave trade was happening, Wakanda stood by. So Killmonger, I think he functions on 2 levels. On the one hand, he functions as the mouthpiece for the opposite opinion. His whole thing is that he wants to be not just interventionist, but he wants to conquer. He wants to go hard in the other direction and take the world by force and forcibly make basically white people come to their knees. But he also functions as a kind of metaphorical representation for all of the African diaspora. Literally in the plot, he is the child of the king's brother who the king decided not to adopt, who the king abandoned. But metaphorically, the reason that exists is because Wakanda abandoned Black people in America. Black people in the whole world, but in particular, people who were forcibly taken into slavery. So I think I sort of have to understand him on a metaphorical level, because that's kind of the only way that I can really understand the king's decision to abandon this child, because Eric Killmonger is the child of Njobu and an American woman. We never meet the American woman, but he basically left Killmonger in Oakland and just left him to his own devices, and his life went down a very violent path.
But it also is a very high achieving path.
Yes.
And this is something that we need to bring up because, well, first of all, I do not understand. That is the big thing in the movie that they don't explain to my satisfaction. Why did the king abandon him? This is his nephew, his brother's child, who is innocent at this point. He doesn't know what his father has done. He's an American kid. He's grown up there, but more importantly, this kid is an amazing student. He grows up to be, does he go to Oxford?
I don't remember what school.
I don't remember either, but I'm sitting here listening to the recitation of his academic honors and the schools that he's gone to and the degrees he has, and thinking, oh my God. And then he ends up being a CIA operative, which is kind of a letdown. But it's because it's written into the script that way, because and we haven't talked about the other character here, Martin Freeman's character.
Oh, yeah.
But what he says about him is pretty amazing.
I think the reason that he became a CIA operative was basically to learn to think the way his enemy thinks, because that's kind of during their final confrontation. And I think his working for the CIA, this is what I think is kind of the most radical part of the movie, is that I think if you take a close look at it, the real bad guy in Black Panther is the CIA, the American CIA. Because they are the ones who made him this violent. He's using their tactics. He's explicitly using their tactics to try to conquer the world. I have a specific thing that I want to talk about that, but my guess is the reason that he joined the CIA is because he knew that the CIA are the best at destroying other countries. This is, if you want to learn how to take over the world, join the CIA.
So Agent Ross at one point says about him, of course he did, and he's talking about destroying the herb.
Yes.
He went in and destroyed the herb that gives the strength back to the king after he has given up his strength to fight the challengers on an even keel. And the quote is, that's what he was trained to do. His unit used to work with the CIA to destabilize foreign countries. They would always strike at transitions of power, like an election year or the death of a monarch. You get control of the government and the military. You have control of their resources.
Yeah.
That's what he has been trained to do. But the interesting thing to me is that this young man is so capable and so smart and has so much talent, yet it is all focused on revenge, gaining control of Wakanda, not to do good with that control, but to destroy what he's letting his anger control what his behavior. And he's so angry that he lost his father and that he was abandoned by the people who should have brought him home. This is a classic story. This happens a lot in movies, mostly with men, mostly with male characters, but he comes back to destroy them because he's hurt.
Yeah.
He is hurt. He has been alone since he was a very young boy. Probably family adopted him. We don't really get that story, and that's another problem with the plot. We don't really know where he lives.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's Oakland loosely, but I think it's because there's so much going on. Like, can you imagine how long this movie would be if we got everyone's backstories?
But if they hit one line, he grew up in foster care, or a family adopted him. That's all they needed to do.
They're kind of ignoring the existence of his mother, I think. So I think I'll just go in and talk about the scenes that since we're talking about Killmonger anyway. Pretty much the only dialogue that I wrote down was these key scenes that I think explain Killmonger as a character. The first one is when he goes to the ancestral plane. And I think it's important to note that when he goes to the ancestral plane, he doesn't go to Wakanda. The visual is not Wakanda. When T'Challa goes, he goes to this very clearly African visual where there's this tree in this like kind of deserty area. But when Killmonger goes, he's in the apartment where his father died.
Their apartment, their home.
Their apartment. And but he does get to talk to his father. His father shows up and is telling him about Wakanda. He says, "The sunsets there are the most beautiful in the world, but I fear you still may not be welcome." And Eric asks why. And Njobu says, "They will say you are lost." Eric says, "But I'm right here." And then there's kind of a pause, and Njobu says, "No tears for me?" And Eric says, "Everybody dies. It's just life around here." That's kind of telling you who Killmonger is and how he got there. He is a person who thinks that violence is all there is and is the answer to everything because it's all that he has ever known. The implication, and again, we don't get the specifics, but the implication is that his dad is not the only person who died around him when he was young. It sounds like a lot of people were lost. And, that's kind of the story that we tell about, people who grow up in extremely poverty-stricken areas that, especially the men in their lives are often taken away from them, either through violence or through police violence or through imprisonment.
And in this movie, while giving lip service to being a forward-thinking culture, they talk a lot about, there seems to be an equality between men and women, and they do give a lot of lip service to ideals that show that they are a very cultivated and sophisticated culture and educated.
Advanced.
So advanced culture. And yet, in many ways, the male and female roles are still very traditional.
Yeah. And it's a monarchy.
It's a monarchy. Why isn't his sister eligible to become the queen.
Well, she is. Sorry, I've seen the second one.
But we can't go by that. We have to go what's in this film. And to me, it looks like it's the first son.
But I do think Shuri is younger. I think they're not being specific, but I think it is the first child. I do think that there's clearly still some gender division, but I think when it comes to the inheritance, I think it's supposed to be the first child. Shuri is younger. But I do also think that there is a kind of, how do I want to put this? Like, I think Killmonger is meant to be kind of a rebuke of toxic masculinity, but I do think that it doesn't quite go far enough, because not only is it a monarchy, but it's a monarchy where you have to fight to the death to be king, and that is in itself toxically masculine.
This is what I'm trying to get to. I don't think the women are eligible to be king, because if they were, his mother would have stepped into the ruler's place, and she doesn't. And that is true of all monarchies ever.
Yeah.
If the king dies, the wife doesn't become the ruling monarch. She steps aside in the oldest child. That's ridiculous. Even when the child is 8 years old. That's ridiculous. It's always been that way. This is a traditional monarchy. The women are so capable and strong. They are full partners in the society in every other way, but his mother can't become the ruler.
Yeah.
And if they are so enlightened, why is ritual combat required of the new king? This is a huge problem for me. And this is a very traditionally made male film.
Yeah.
There's a male director. The two writers are men. This is a male-centric film. It's not like The Woman King. You know what I mean? Hand-to-hand combat is important there too. I shouldn't say that. But so why didn't the sister challenge for the throne? She could have done that, but she doesn't.
I mean, I do think that at that point in time, she might just not have been interested, because in the first movie, she's the tech girl, you know? It seems to me like she's more...
But to me, that's an excuse. That's an excuse to make this a film about men. Instead of, Shuri is like one of the most capable women in this movie.
Yeah.
She would have made a great leader. Why is she not even considerate?
Yeah, I do think there is a distinct decision not to really interrogate the systems of power. And I would say that I think even if Shuri had challenged, that still doesn't quite go far enough, because I'm just anti-monarchy. Whether it's a patriarchal one or a matriarchal one, I think monarchies are a bad idea. And I think a lot of the events of this film are proof of that. Like, the only reason that Killmonger is able to almost destroy the country and the world is because it's a monarchy, and he technically has a birthright because he's T'Challa's cousin, and he, wins a hand-to-hand fight. That's a terrible way to decide who's going to rule your country. No. The person who's the best physical fighter is not the person who's going to be the best political leader.
Absolutely. And that is, that's not a democracy. They try to make it sound like it's fair somehow, because all of the tribes can send somebody to stage a challenge. But it's not an intellectual challenge. Mm-mm. It's not a literary challenge. Yeah. They're not writing poems here.
They're not going to
fighting.
Pass two laws and see which law is better.
Yeah. They're not going to, there's not an IQ test involved. It is a hand-to-hand combat. And that, to me, Western civilization has gone way past that point. In some ways we're still fighting hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
And we're still primitive. But it's a primitive notion. It's a primitive approach to leadership. You've got the luck of the draw. If this guy had been somebody else and he had just been strong, mm-hmm. but had not had the wisdom or the intellect to run the country, he still could have been the monarch. Mm-hmm. And that's scary. That's a scary notion. And we have reason to know this, because we have long history in Western civilization of really bad monarchs who just lucked into their roles and almost destroyed their cultures. Yeah. So there's reason to be suspicious of this kind of monarchy, of this kind of situation.
Yeah, I think monarchies, are inherently unstable, because basically every time you get a new king, it's a complete luck of the draw. And it's honestly tilted against them being a good leader, because most monarchies, the family of the monarchy is typically very secluded and has no idea what life is really like for normal people, because they never live that life.
Yes.
They live this secluded, cosseted little life, and maybe they're trained to be a leader, or maybe they're not. But even if they are, they're trained by someone who was similarly secluded from life. That they never have to experience the life of a normal person, and they never have to experience the effect of their own rule. It's a very bad system top to bottom, regardless of whether or not it's sexist, and they're always sexist, which just makes it worse.
And I think the filmmakers kind of think that, well, their salvation is their technology, but it's not. Technology is not a salvation.
Yeah.
And Shuri is a tech genius, and she does come to the rescue over and over again, but that's a Band-Aid. Technology is something you use to implement better ideas, or at least it should be, a way to improve the lives of people in your country, but they're using it mostly defensively. And apparently, as we find out in the final battle, they have a lot of technology that is war-like in nature. So the other thing is I find the battle scenes very boring. Not just the actual battle scenes, but the hand-to-hand combat scenes. They go on forever, and what is the point? I know I'm at a point where when I see movies, there's not just one hand-to-hand combat scene here. There are two or three of them.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them, and boy, I'm sitting here scratching my head and thinking, a man made this movie.
Yeah. I mean, also Marvel made this movie.
Marvel made this movie, but how many other Marvel films were there? Well, there are a lot of battle scenes.
There's so many pointless action scenes in Marvel movies. I actually think this movie has some of the better action scenes, because most of the action scenes in Marvel movies are like semi-indecipherable.
Yeah, I think all of that stuff is. I think you're absolutely correct. All those kinds of scenes are just intolerable, and they go on and on and on. And every time I see them, it's like, they're making these movies for young boys, for teenage boys. And even this film seems to have those elements. It's being,
for sure,
they think the audience is teenage boys. So at this point, they're on the verge of losing me as an audience member, because I am bored to tears during these scenes.
I think the only fight scene that I truly enjoyed in this one is the one that happens in Korea, and it's largely just because the background is really cool. That's
in the bar.
Yeah, in the bar where when they're all in, that's the one. Basically, honestly, half of what I like is just when Denai Guerrera does flips and they make her skirt flutter behind her. I like that visual. It's sort of more dancey almost.
Well, anytime the women are fighting, it's a little bit more interesting to watch.
Yeah,
because they're not fighting hand-to-hand combat. They are using weapons.
Yeah.
And a lot of what they do is choreographed, so it looks like a dance almost.
Also, Claw is in that scene, and Claw's funny.
He is funny. He's a funny character, yeah.
So I feel like out of all of the fight scenes, that to me is the most fun one to watch, because there's different stuff going on. First of all, there's sort of a keep away thing that's happening. There's a physical thing that they're all trying to go after, and also they're trying to capture Claw, and Claw is kind of funny and sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's also the scene where Black Panther is first experimenting with the new technology that Shuri has put into the suit, where it absorbs kinetic energy, and then he can kind of, so that scene is it has the most going on in terms of different elements to complicate it, and it's got Denai Guerrera flipping around in the pretty dress, and then it goes into the chase scene that was also kind of fun.
Yeah, the chase scene is actually one of the better chase scenes I've ever seen. So it's really well done, and then it's hilarious too, because when her chair in the car just kind of disintegrates around her, and her chair, her driver's seat chair comes to a stop, and she's kind of scooting along, and she's sitting there looking around, and her car is gone, and it's just her steering wheel in her seat. That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's
That's
highly improbable,
visual.
but a very funny moment. Yeah,
very improbable. Yeah,
yeah. I feel that's, I guess it's sort of one continuous scene. That scene, I think, is the best action in the film. And unfortunately, I think the worst action scene in the film is the final one, because it's just it's another giant Marvel mashup where everyone's just sort of running at each other. The pacing is just nonstop. There's a moment in that scene where Killmonger is fighting Shuri and her weapons fail, and he's gonna kill her. And it should be this dramatic tension moment, but it lasts for a second, and then Black Panther pushes him over the edge, and then we immediately go into this long CGI sequence where there's just two CGI images tumbling through the air and fighting each other, and literally my eyes glazed over. I was like, wait, for a second there we had emotional stakes. We had Shuri is in danger, and Shuri is sort of our bright little angel in this film. She's the funniest character, and she's also the actress is very smart small and skinny, so she feels the most physically vulnerable. So, you know, that should have been a really emotionally intense moment, but it's like half a second long. There's no moment to draw out that tension. I mean, it's kind of my overall issue with the pacing of this film, which it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's non-stop, and that's kind of a Marvel thing. These movies just want to like assault your senses non-stop, which means that there's no moment to like breathe and feel the emotional stakes. I should have been on the edge of my seat about whether or not Shuri was going to die. And instead, I'm like, oh no, Shuri's in. Oh no, never mind. She's not in trouble anymore.
Well, and even the scenes in Korea. And I think the only reason they put those scenes in Korea was so that there was some part of the movie that wasn't in Africa where they have cars. Where they have these cars so they can have a car chase. And at some point, I actually wrote in my notes, oh my God, they destroyed 3 cars.
I know.
3 cars.
They also destroy like a market.
Yeah, and is it Nakia? Is driving barefoot. Did you notice that? She's driving barefoot in most of the scenes. And they keep showing her feet. And it's like, why are they showing her feet? Oh, she's driving barefoot. I don't know why.
I didn't notice that,
anyway,
but I will admit that I have sometimes driven barefoot.
There is a couple of things here, too, that at some point I wrote in my notes, Martin Freeman is a CIA agent. Agent Ross, and in my notes I have, is a CIA guy the good guy here? Because he is kind of.
I mean, yeah, so that kind of gets to the tension at the heart of this film in terms of theme, because on the one hand, I do feel like ultimately the CIA kind of are the bad guys because they created Killmonger to a certain extent. I mean, like also the king's decision to abandon him, but the tactics that he's using are explicitly CIA tactics. But we have to soften that by having, milquetoast little Martin Freeman play this like sweet CIA guy who's like on a dime willing to sacrifice himself for this country that he's never been to before.
He absolutely is. There's a moment in the movie where you are absolutely convinced he's going to die because he is operating the ship. They do a lot of things virtually. Yeah. So he's actually in the offices, in the tech offices.
He's in Shuri's lab
and in the control room in her lab. Yeah. And the thing that's flying, whatever it is outside flying. Yeah. He's in there, but something is coming.
I think it's one of the things that he's chasing with the ship turns around and comes for him in the lab.
Comes for him because they figure out he's controlling the ship. We have to get at him. He's losing power, and Shuri tells him, you're at 50% power. You got to get out of there. And he says, how many ships are left? And he asks, and he thinks he can do it. He makes a calculated risk assessment, basically, and decides that I think I can do this. He barely does. He does survive. Spoilers, sorry, but just barely. Yeah. And you're absolutely convinced, and he's so stoic about it. He's like Martin Freeman is an interesting actor for me. I love this guy. Although a part of me was also sitting there thinking, gotta have a white guy in here to save the day.
I always refer to him as the token white guy in this
token white guy. But his characters tend to be very stoic, but in a funny way. And this character especially has a sense of humor, but it's very dry. And it comes across in just a couple of lines, and you're sitting there laughing, and he never cracks a smile. Yeah. But yet he along with several of the Wakandans, are the heroes of the movie. And he is the bridge then. Because of how he stays and helps them win the war and keep control of their country. He is the bridge to Western society for them. Later on, or at least we think he's going to be. Yeah. So it's a good thing.
I mean, I do think that his character exists the way it does because ultimately this is a huge blockbuster Marvel movie, and it cannot end on an unambiguous note that the U.S. is evil. And to that effect, I do want to read the second set of quotes that I've got down here because it's related. While Killmonger and T'Challa are fighting after the stupid CGI fall, while they're fighting on the train platform, there's a moment where they are forced to pause because when the train there's like a train that keeps passing between them. They're basically on a railroad track, but there's just enough room on either side that the train passes between them and forces the fighting to stop, which I do think was a very clever filmmaking note because again, like so much of this movie is breakneck pace. It's nice to get a forced pause in the middle of all of the fighting where the two characters can just talk to each other when they would otherwise just be fighting.
It saps their energy, too. They both have special powers, and when the train is passing, they're losing their powers.
I think it's interrupting the suit that they wear.
It's interrupting the suit, and their suits start to deteriorate, but then it comes back.
So Killmonger says, I don't need a suit to kill you. Your reign is over. You sat up here safe and protected. T'Challa says, you want to see us become just like the people you hate so much. Divide and conquer the land as they did. Killmonger says, nah, I learned from my enemies. Beat them at their own game. And T'Challa says, you have become them. You will destroy the world, Wakanda included. I believe they are literally talking about the CIA. They're talking about the American CIA. And I think this is T'Challa's final indictment of Killmonger is you have become just like them. You have become the colonizer. What you are doing is just a different form of colonizing. I do think he's right. I mean, the interesting thing about Killmonger is that he starts off by making some good points. We didn't talk about this, but the scene in which Killmonger is introduced is the scene where he shows up at the British Museum, which is notoriously full of stolen artifacts, largely from Africa, from lots of different marginalized countries. I mean, there was just a whole period of British history where British so-called archaeologists just went to other countries, especially Egypt, and just stole shit and brought it back to England, and now it's in the British Museum. And there are multiple pretty well publicized battles with the British Museum and other countries who are trying to get their ancestral artifacts back, and the British Museum won't let them. And that was in the news in the lead up to this movie. That was a current topic. It's still a current topic, but it was something that people were becoming more and more aware of. So that opening scene where Killmonger is in the British Museum and he steals back artifacts and also has this very confrontational exchange with the woman who's supposedly the expert on these artifacts, and he tries to confront her about how the British Museum came to get these things, because she says something like, they're not for sale, and he goes, oh, do you think the people who took these paid for them? The implication being like, I'm going to take them just like they were taken before. It's a very powerful scene and a powerful way to start the movie, and it does kind of put you a little bit on Killmonger's side. He starts by making a very valid point. He wants to steal back what was originally stolen. Unfortunately, the way that he does that is by killing everybody, which, is never the right call.
You think that the CIA is kind of the bad guy here, and that they created Killmonger, but I don't think they did, and I don't think T'Challa thinks they did either. In the second ancestral plane dream sequence with his dad, he's confronting his father, and saying, you leaving this little boy on his own in this foreign country, away from his people, away from his family, is what created this situation. He is a monster of our own making, is what he says to him. I must take the mantle back and right these wrongs. He's saying this to his father. And he tells him, other people, the father is saying other people, and this actually gets to the theme that we're going to be getting to in a minute, but his father says to him, other people are not our people. It is my responsibility to make sure our people are safe. And Chewbacca says to him, you were wrong. To turn your backs on the rest of the world, we let the fear of our discovery stop us from doing what is right. And then in addition to that, we created Killmonger.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'm saying it's both. I think both parties are at fault, but I'm talking about this specific exchange between Killmonger and T'Challa, where Killmonger says, I learned from my enemies. I don't think his enemies are Wakanda. His enemies are white colonizers. And T'Challa says, you have become them.
I think you're right. Colonizers is a term they use several times in the movie as well.
Yeah.
And they use it really interestingly, in fact.
I think the script is intentionally written to not say you have become the CIA, but I think if you kind of follow the money there, we already heard where Killmonger learned the tactics from. He learned them from the CIA.
Yes. And Agent Ross says that.
Yeah.
And but the scene where we first hear the term colonizer, Shuri calls Agent Ross, you mean the colonizer?
Yeah.
And I love how she just kind of throws that away. So apparently that's a term that they easily use with Westerners, I would say. They're colonized. And they're right. They're absolutely right. They are colonized.
And I think we should also talk a little bit about what Killmonger's plan is, because I don't think we've actually said. Killmonger's plan is basically to flood the world with guns. He wants to take the weapons that have been created in Wakanda, which, the thing that we're not focusing on in the movie is Wakanda. Why did you make all these weapons if you weren't planning on using them? Killmonger's plan is to take all of these weapons and bring them, specifically, he says, New York, London, and Hong Kong. I'm not entirely sure why Hong Kong is on that list, but whatever. He wants to send weapons out to, he calls them the war dogs. I think they are some of the secret operatives for Wakanda. He wants to send them weapons and have them spread them through the diaspora and then start a war. And again, they never explicitly say this, but it is implied that it's a war against white people, a war against the white colonizers. And, again, it's one of those things where it's like, from a revenge perspective, I see why you want that. I see why that's emotionally appealing. And I'm not going to stand here and defend white colonizers. But what I am going to say is more guns just means more violence,
Two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly where this kind of rule comes
in.
You doing something as bad as they are doing does not make the world a better place.
We live in America, which is basically test case number 1 for what happens when a country has a lot of guns. And what happens is children die. We are the one country in the world that has a constant problem with school shootings. That is because our country is flooded with drugs. With guns.
Yeah, I knew what you meant.
If your plan is to just send more guns into the world, sure, you are going to end up killing some white people, but you're also just going to end up increasing the number of deaths and increasing the number of innocent people who are killed on the sidelines.
What's interesting is the difference in Killmonger and T'Challa is that they are both a new form of leader for this country, but in completely different ways. So T'Challa, when W'Kabi accuses T'Challa of being no different from his father, what's actually happening is the opposite. T'Challa is different.
He is,
He hasn't quite figured it out yet. He's got a kind of wisdom that is almost like a once-in-a-generation kind of thing when you see in people. And sometimes it never gets nurtured, and sometimes it does. If you're lucky, it gets nurtured, and that wisdom makes this person, man or woman, a great leader.
Yeah.
And he is open to being open to the rest of the world. He doesn't make the decision until the very end to do that, but it's kind of niggling at his brain. He's thinking about it. And so it's not just about, when he saves Agent Ross, it's not just about saving Ross. It's that you cannot hide your head in the sand. He comes to this realization through this interaction with his cousin, Killmonger, with what he sets in place. Killmonger sets in place things that happen that force him to think about the future of this country and what he wants, not just for his country, but for his planet. And that's a very different way of looking at the world. And it's a message that I think, despite it being a Marvel film, they are successfully sending out to world leaders. What kind of a world do you want?
Yeah.
And this is what he is trying to think through and work through. And that's what changes in the film. And he's changing his country. He's changing his way of thinking. And he's hoping. And apparently there are a lot of people who already think that. Nakia is one.
Yes.
I'm not sure about his sister or his mom.
Yeah.
She doesn't really have much of a role.
Yeah, they don't really ever express their feelings one way or the other. But we're talking about a movie that came out in 2018 and is canonically set in the year that it came out. I'm sure most of the people are tired of hiding their own country from the world. Like, the world knows that Wakanda exists but doesn't know anything about it. No one's allowed to go there, and it seems like the only people who are allowed to leave are the ones who are spies. So I'm sure most of the country would love to actually be a part of the world.
And here's another thing I just want to point out. I said that I hate all the battle scenes, all the hand-to-hand combat and the battle scenes. I'm just so tired of that trope in movies over and over again, mostly movies made by men, although The Woman King was made by women. But the fighting in The Woman King serves a purpose in every single scene.
It's also not so nonstop. It's not the majority of the film. It's specific moments.
Moves the plot along every time it happens.
And there's always emotional stakes.
Yes. There's a scene towards the end of that battle where Okoye is winning seeing the fight with W'Kabi, and at this point, I have completely forgotten that they're in a relationship.
Yeah.
And they mention it at the beginning of the film, but so much stuff has happened that I completely forget it. Anyway, so she has got him at the point of her spear.
Mm-hmm.
He says to her, "Would you kill me, my love?"
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, "Oh yeah, that's right, they're a couple." And she says, "For Wakanda, without question." This for me foreshadows the Woman King, but it reverses the role of weak women, strong men, but also visually, it's such an arresting scene because and it's just a few seconds.
Yeah.
You see them from one angle, and then the camera switches, and you see them in front of basically a sunset that's behind them, and the beauty of Africa is behind them. And so it's the image of her holding this spear over him, pointing it at him as he surrenders. He gets down on his knees because he realizes she will kill him. And he gets down on his knees, he surrenders, and then all the men, because he's the leader of the warriors, all the men surrender. It's the most powerful image in the movie.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, even though W'Kabi is kind of a complicated character, because at first you really like him. And then he decides to go along with what Killmonger wants. He literally becomes a Killmonger himself.
For very little reason. This is one of my
very
issues
little
with the pacing
yes.
of this film, is like his whole thing is he wants T'Challa to kill Claw or to bring him back, and T'Challa goes and does a very good job in the fight against Claw, and they actually do capture him, but they they literally give Ross 5 minutes to interview him, and then right after that Killmonger unexpectedly shows up, because no one at that point, none of the good guys know that Killmonger exists. He shows up and takes Claw, and it's basically been like one day, and then T'Challa comes back without Claw, and this guy, wait, I've already forgotten his name. W'Kabi. Yeah. W'Kabi is just like, okay, well, that was all your chances. You're done now.
It's a very black and white situation for him, and that's not what this is. He won't even let T'Challa explain.
Yeah.
And it's like, this was a very complicated situation. Yeah, I could have killed everybody in the room.
Yeah.
But what would that do? You know, sometimes you put people at risk when you want to make these kinds of captures. Or if I had killed or captured this guy, it would have killed a lot of other people in the process. These are complicated things that warrior mentalities, military mentalities don't seem to be able to understand or embrace. Or at least that's why they're portrayed in movies like this. Very black and white way of thinking. So he immediately switches sides to Killmonger, and then becomes the guy that we don't like, and we completely forget during that process that he and Okoye are a couple. Until this scene, and it brings it all back, and you gotta wonder, because we don't know what happens, but you gotta wonder what happens to W'Kabi. Does he find salvation? And this is a movie about salvation. We're gonna get to that in a minute. But does he find salvation? Does he, in his love for her? It's a very subtle theme.
I'm assuming,
we don't know yet.
I'm assuming their relationship is over. I'm assuming she's done with him. Like,
okay, all right, we don't know. I haven't seen the next movie. You've seen it, right?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I have seen the next movie. I don't 100% remember if he's in it. If he is, it's a very small role. My feeling is that he's just sort of imprisoned, but I don't actually remember if he's in. Okoye is in it. It's mostly about Okoye and Shuri, but do think she's pretty single in the movie at the very least. I mean, you know, she barely feels like she's in a relationship in this movie.
But he is a great warrior. Mm-hmm. So is he somebody who can be brought back into the fold? I think is a question that I have at the end there, because he does start off the movie, even though he's a black and white thinker, he's still a very interesting character. He definitely, reveres his king until he makes this mistake of not bringing back the bad guy who killed.
And then just completely turns on a dime, which
I
feel like is partly because, again, this film has a lot of plot to get through, so we got to keep this moving.
Okay, so the last scene I want to mention is when at the end of T'Challa and Killmonger's fight, when Killmonger is mortally wounded, you can see when T'Challa looks at him, the look on his face is sorrow. It's not hatred. He does not hate his cousin, and you know that in a different world they would have been as close as brothers. But Killmonger has so much anger over the loss of his father, and really, even though he's the quote unquote king, there's no amount of power that can take that away or make it better. So when he's dying, he asks him, I just really want to see the beauty of Wakanda.
Yeah.
Yeah, so T'Challa takes him outside to where he can see the beautiful Wakanda, and he dies looking at the sunset, and that's a form of salvation for him because I don't know how much he doesn't seem to really say, he never says he's sorry, but he at least made it home to his homeland and got to see his homeland and meet his family, even if he did just try to kill them all.
Yeah. Yeah, and their final exchange when they're up there, T'Challa says, "Maybe we can still heal you." And Killmonger says, "Why? So you can just lock me up? Nah, just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from the ships because they knew death was better than bondage."
And there's the one reference to slavery in the movie.
Yes, that is the one very explicit reference to slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it, and I think it's very indicative of Killmonger's whole thing. This is basically him saying, "No, I'm never going to stop trying. I'm not going to accept bondage, and I'm not going to accept forgiveness. Like I am
He's
going to
too
always,
far gone.
Yeah, I'm going to always be a problem for you."
Yeah, he's too damaged. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
He knows that.
And, and I think it's a very powerful statement. And I also personally think he's wrong because you only get one life. And
I agree.
If you're in bondage, and this actually does lead into the other point that I wanted to make, bondage is never okay, but as long as you're not dead, there's a chance that you will get to do something else. The only final end is death. And this brings me to my other point because the thing that I kept thinking about while I was watching this movie is Killmonger reminds me so much of Magneto. And this whole setup reminds me, it's very similar to, and I keep wanting to call him Picard, it's very similar to the Xavier Magneto dichotomy. Both of these stories, both Black Panther and X-Men, are basically about being a marginalized identity. And X-Men at different times has been interpreted as being about race and civil rights, but it's also been interpreted as being about being gay. And it is an explicit feature of Magneto's personality that he lived through the Holocaust. He is Jewish, ancestrally Jewish, and survived the Holocaust, and that's why he has this more violent outlook than Xavier did, because Xavier didn't live through that. He had a relatively privileged upbringing. They are both belonging to the marginalized identity that is mutants, but Magneto has a much more aggressive outlook. Magneto's whole thing is basically he wants to take over before they can destroy him. He wants to have the mutants take over because he thinks it's just a matter of time before the mutants are sent to concentration camps. But the difference between him and Killmonger is I don't think Magneto would ever say death is better than bondage, because he knows that as long as he's still alive, he's still got a chance. And that's why that movie ends, the first X-Men movie ends with Magneto getting locked up, because he's not ready for the story to be over. And, also their upbringings are different. Magneto is not typically a character who is, in conversation with toxic masculinity. I do think that Killmonger is. And, I agree with you that this is still a very male-centric movie, and, it was written and directed by a man. My personal take is that it doesn't quite go far enough, and that's why I think it's very important to talk about the Woman King, because I think the Woman King is able to tackle these conversations and go all the way with them, in large part because it's about women, so it just has to be in conversation with systems of power and patriarchal systems of power in particular. But I do think that Killmonger is written to be a toxically masculine character. He's a character who cannot back down and who has internalized this very violent idea of what it is to be a man. It didn't come from out of nowhere. It came about because he has lived this violent and impoverished life, but that doesn't mean that turning to violence is okay. It's interesting because I think that Killmonger is a very interesting character, and I do think that they're trying to say something about toxic masculinity, but it is interesting that while doing that, the film never really questions the masculine systems of power that Wakanda upholds. The monarchy itself, the transition of power, all of these things are very patriarchal and are very masculine and violent, and they're not that far removed from what Killmonger is talking about. You know, what he wants to do is way more extreme, but you know, I mean, it's wild that every time they get a new king, they maybe have a fight to the death. You know, that is a toxic masculinity thing, because that is coming from the belief that the strongest warrior is naturally the best leader, and that's just not true. That's just a toxic belief. But yeah, I feel like Killmonger is in many ways very similar to Magneto in terms of what they represent in the story. And hilariously, they're both named Eric. They both have the first name Eric. As you know, it's just a trivia thing, but that's interesting. Mm-hmm. It made me think a little bit about Marvel villains. I know there's some discourse out there about Marvel villains. A lot of Marvel villains tend to be the main character but evil. And I don't think that's entirely what's happening here, and I don't think that's what's happening with Magneto either. I feel like Magneto and Killmonger are a little bit different. They're more like, this is a different philosophy, and this character is a representation of this philosophy. Yeah. It comes from a similar place because both the villain and the main character are members of a marginalized group, but it's not so much that one is the evil version of the other. It's more that they have parallel philosophies.
Yeah, I don't see them as villains. I mean, they're not one-dimensional villains anyway.
Yeah, they're some of the better.
Complex.
Yeah, they're some of the better. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always felt like Magneto is the best Marvel villain, and I think Killmonger is also one of the best. Marvel
He's a very
villains.
very good character, fascinating character. Everything he goes through, it's just, you could almost, if you want to read the comic books to see more about the character.
Well, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a run of the comic books, so that might be the one.
Who did?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, wow, yeah. Really?
So that might be, if you want to read one, that might be the one that you want to read.
All right. So this is the point in the show where we do our hot takes. Tess typically has more than I do. I think this time I might have more than she does.
Yeah, my feeling is that any opinion that you have on this movie at this point is a hot take.
Yeah, the 5 points that I have written down, I've already talked about most of them. So, you know, first of all, it's a very male movie. We talked about that. The women are equals, but they are men in women's clothing in many ways. So I take issue with that. For example, Angela Bassett has a very small role. You know, she is such a fascinating, she's a great actress, and she could have been a much more interesting character, but she's feminine. She's very feminine. And the feminine is missing in this movie, I think. Yeah. So, because it's a very militaristic and monarchical film. So that's one thing. All the main production credits are men, except the director of photography, except for the visual components. So the director of photography is a woman, Rachel Morrison. Production designers, Hannah Beachler. Costume designers, Ruth Carter. These are all visual roles rather than thematic or storytelling roles, production roles.
There are also departments that are typically headed by women.
Typically headed by women, yeah. And that doesn't bother me so much, but when men are telling the story, it's a very different perspective from when women are telling the story. And you don't get a better example of that than this movie versus The Woman King. Very different perspectives on women in power, how women use power, how they are warriors, how they fight. Very different perspectives. So this movie, this is my third point. This movie was made in 2018, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, before COVID. And while we still had not acquired, I think, such a hard veneer of cynicism about how connected we need to be to the rest of the world, I think when COVID hit, we got much more cynical about being connected to the rest of the world, which is a shame. There's his speech at the end of the movie he gives to the UN is optimistic, but it's also super unrealistic today. It probably wasn't in 2018. But he says, in times of crisis, the wise build bridges while the foolish build barriers. We must find a way to look after one another as if we were one single tribe. And the very first thing anyone says is, yeah, what do you have to offer the rest of us? Meaning, what can you do for us? So, you know, the Western world reacts to his message cynically. So the question here is service to an idea, the throne and who sits on it, more important than loyalty to the ones you love and to their ideas of community and sacrifice? That's one of the questions in here. So in his speech to the UN, he says that Wakanda will no longer watch from the shadows. We cannot, we must not. We will work to be an example of how we as brothers and sisters on this earth should treat each other. Now more than ever, the illusions of division threaten our very existence. More connects us than separates us. So that's a real important theme in this movie, is how do we stay connected and keep our identity? Because we have a lot of different countries, different ethnicities on this planet. So everybody wants to keep their cultural identity. But at the same time, we need each other. We have to feel connected. So the question I think that the film is asking, the big question, is how much responsibility do we bear for other humans? If we have wealth and strength, is it our moral responsibility to help others? In some ways, Wakanda has been, up until the point of the action in the film, has been a metaphor for isolationism, because they are, nobody knows who they truly are. They've hidden themselves. So is it a good thing to come out of that? Is it going to destroy them? We don't know yet. And do we have a responsibility to other humans? I think the answer is yes. And I think that T'Challa comes to that realization. And so the whole film is kind of and here we go again, it's kind of another coming of age movie where he grows up. He doesn't just take on the mantle of the king. He takes on the wisdom of being a leader and comes to the realization that he has to move his people into the future. And the only way they can do that is to use their power for good. That's an old idea. It's Superman, it's Batman, it's all these heroes. We need to use our power for good. We have power, we have science, we have technology, we have this resource, vibranium, that is a gift from the gods, and we need to put it to good use. And I think that's what we end on, even though he's standing there at the United Nations and he's talking to the rest of the world, and you can just see the looks on the faces of the people. What can you do for us?
Mm-hmm.
You can see that there's going to be a battle in the future. I don't have to see the next movie to know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world is going to try and invade Wakanda. If that's not what happens, that's great. But that's what I see happening. Is that what happens?
No, it's not what happens. I mean, the complication of the second movie is just the fact that Chadwick Boseman died.
Yeah.
So the second movie,
they have to kill him off because nobody wanted anybody else to be in this role.
Yeah.
There was a big controversy about it after he died. We love the story, we love the movie, but nobody else can ever be Black Panther.
So yeah, I guess I'll put a note in this that we also kind of spoil Wakanda Forever a little bit. Although I don't really feel like this is a spoiler. The second movie is basically about Shuri taking up the role of Black Panther and overcoming her grief over T'Challa's death. So I think Chadwick Boseman's death necessarily changed the trajectory of where they were going to go. So I don't know what they would have done if he hadn't died, what the other sequel would have been. But the film that exists is largely about Shuri kind of having to, it's basically now Shuri's turn to come of age, but it's complicated by her grief, which is kind of way more present in the film than, in this one. Like, obviously T'Challa is grieving for his father, but it's different in part because, it coincided with the death of an actual actor, and also because the character is someone that we knew a lot more than T'Challa's father, and he was still very young. So, yeah. And there's also, there's another American character in it. I think her name is Riri, who they discover, and it's kind of her story as well. To be honest, the next movie is a little bit scattershot. It's a little all over the place. But my point is basically just, I'm not sure that it's the movie that they originally intended to have come next, because it was impacted by real life events.
And that's a shame, because I'm sure they could have made a really good follow-up movie. Not that a movie about Shuri isn't in and of itself worthwhile, because she's a really interesting character, and I would love to see her developed more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to lighten things up a little bit, my facetious hot take is that M'Baku is the hottest man in this film.
Now, which one is that?
He's the leader of the mountain tribe. I just think he's so cute.
Oh.
I just think he's so cute. Winston Duke is very charismatic, and he's kind of the funniest of the guys. Like, the women get to be very funny, but he's kind of the only dude who gets to be funny, and I like funny guys. I mean, yes, Michael B. Jordan is physically very beautiful, but M'Baku is the one who has my heart. If I had to date a man in this movie, it would be M'Baku. And that's my facetious hot take. My more serious hot take is, I think comic book movies are ultimately probably never going to be able to deal with these themes in a truly satisfactory way, and especially high budget Marvel movies. You know, at the end of the day,
I agree.
High budget Marvel movies are all beholden to their shareholders, and that's why they are packed with action scenes, because it is a money making factory. And so I think that this is definitely one of the most thematically interesting movies, but ultimately it falls short of where it should go, because it has to end on T'Challa being the hero. It kind of has to always fall back on this theory of history, that history is run by individual great men, because that's what the superhero format is about. It's about a singular great hero who can just come in and fix everything. And that's just a very flawed view of history. That's typically not how things work. Even, you know, the people that we attribute great scientific discoveries for, usually those attributions erase the work of a bunch of different people. Like the guy who supposedly invented the smallpox vaccine, he actually was inspired by female nurses who used cowpox to inoculate themselves against it. So it was actually a lot more work usually goes into these, you know, brilliant moments of advancement, but it's always attributed to one man. And superhero stories really run with that. There's always a central guy who can fix everything, and it's usually a guy. Every once in a while it's a woman, but in Marvel in particular, in this latest run, it's usually a guy. I won't go too far into my own issues with Marvel. I think that Marvel in general has this tendency to pretend that it's way more diverse and dedicated to marginalized stories than it actually is. Marvel technically has a lot of female characters, but half of them frickin' died in Endgame. So I just, you know, I have a lot of issues with Marvel as someone who has seen a lot of the films and really hated Endgame. But fortunately, I do think that this film, I actually had not rewatched it because of Chadwick Boseman's death. It was so sad to me that the thought of rewatching it, even though I really enjoyed it when I first saw it in theaters, I had never rewatched it before rewatching it for this. It just seemed like it would make me really sad.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I did the same thing. I hadn't rewatched it either. And it was a really good movie. I think at the time that it came out, you and I talked about this is the best of the Marvel movies.
Yeah.
And it can stand alone. And there's so many good things about it. And then Mr. Boseman died. And I had no interest in ever watching it again because it was just too sad.
But that being said, I'm really glad this movie exists. You know, again, I don't think it goes quite far enough, but I do personally believe that The Woman King was made because this movie was so successful. And I think The Woman King deals with a lot of similar themes, but is able to go all the way because it was not a part of the Marvel machine. And you know, obviously people are going to have some criticisms of that movie as well. You should be critical of all movies. But despite the fact that I feel like thematically this film comes short, it's a good stepping stone. It's good that it exists, and I hope that people will continue to come back to this movie, because I think for a lot of people, this might be their introduction to looking at colonialism, to looking at the terrible and storied history of the CIA, because largely this is still a very bright and shiny and easy to digest Marvel package, but it's got these little nuggets in there, and I think that's very important. And on top of that, all of the actors in this movie are great. If what you want is an action movie that has a little bit more to chew on, it is good for that.
I'd like to add one more comment or thought or whatever. We talked just briefly when we were talking about Chadwick Boseman dying so young after having such a packed movie career, and how many other actors there's a history of actors dying young, and some of them made a lot of movies, some of them didn't make a lot of movies. James Dean only made 3, but Heath Ledger died really young. River Phoenix was on the rise, and he died really young. Both Brandon Lee and his father, Bruce Lee, died really young.
Well, I'm gonna say Brittany Murphy.
Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, Marilyn Monroe. Yeah.
Died really, yeah, and Brittany Murphy
Brittany
is on the
Murphy.
list. I don't know her work, but yeah, Brittany Murphy and Sharon Tate, who wasn't considered a great actress.
To be fair, hadn't she only been in like 1 or 2 movies?
No, she'd been in quite a few movies actually, but smaller roles.
Okay.
She wasn't really a leading lady until she married what's his face, Roman Polanski, and he put her in some of his movies. Yeah, but Marilyn Monroe is another really good example. So it's not all men. It's mostly men though.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a throwaway out there. We had talked about it a little bit. I couldn't come up with any names, but I think that, dear listeners, is all for today.
That's all for today. I'm Tessa Dare. You can find me at my website, tessadare.com, where you can sign up for my email list, or you can follow me on Instagram at author.tess.adair, or on Threads, or on TikTok, also at author.tess.adair. And you can follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/whereyoulead.
And I am Beth Von Baron. You can follow me on Instagram at STL_writer_Beth, or sign up for my weekly Substack email, Saturday Morning Musings, at stlwriterbeth.substack.com. This has been Woman Inherits the Earth, a discussion podcast about women and movies from the perspective of a mother and daughter. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll tune in for our next episode in about 2 weeks. See you then.